You have to be observant because you're not really creating characters out of nothing. You're creating characters based on all of your experiences and people you've met and people you've known. That's really your job. That's your whole job, is to be observant.
Welcome to You Are A Storyteller, an award-winning podcast produced in Seattle, Washington by Belief Agency. On this week's episode, McDonald and Jesse Bryan discuss how you can use storytelling principles to create characters that serve a purpose.
Here's something most people might not understand about us. We actually read the comments. And if people have questions, we want to address them, right? And we actually got a really interesting one.
Let me just say something. You read the comments.
I read the comments, and then the ones that I think would be helpful for you to know, I bring to your attention, and then the other ones I do not.
I don't want the negativity. Let me just say that.
I get it.
I don't, I don't want it. So
I get it.
So
I've seen
not all of it,
I've seen some of the emails you get, and I get that.
Yeah.
So I go through and I source things that I think could make interesting questions from folks. And one of the ones we got from one of the folks that watched, which is actually, I thought was a really good one. And we've touched on this a little bit. Mm-hmm. So figuring out, there's been enough people that have asked something like this question that I think would be helpful to the folks that watch. And the question was just simply, when it comes to writing characters that sound different, in essence, how do I take these principles we've been talking about, armature, different structure pieces, talked about contrast, we talked about all these different principles, and how do you apply them to a character? Specifically, her question was writing characters that sound different.
Right.
And I'm trying not to anticipate your answer. So on this week's episode, we're going to talk about writing characters. How do you take all these large principles you've been explaining over the last, I don't know how long we've been doing this, and apply them when it comes specifically to writing characters?
Okay.
Well, let me ask you this. First thing that pops in your mind when I ask you this question.
Well, characters serve a function. And so you have to know their function first, I think. Uh-huh. Now, it depends on the way you write, right? Some people start with characters.
Yeah.
Then they have to eventually find an armature to tell, it's a harder way to work sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's where some people are drawn to characters, and then there's a way you can start with a character and it can work, but it can be difficult to work that way.
I think what's interesting about that is I was on Twitter the other day, and those like different channels that just have to do quotes from writers, and one of them was, writing is all about figuring out who your characters are. That's the most important thing. And I remember reading and going, that sounds exhausting, right? Can you talk about why when you say, so let's just go back. You said characters exist to serve a purpose.
Right.
Can you unpack that first?
Sure. Well, okay. Because I'm a Gen Xer, I'm going to talk about a show nobody who listens to this will know. But there might be some. But in the Mary Tyler Moore Show, one of my very favorite TV shows, there's the character of Mary, and Mary is supposed to be a little naive, she's a grown woman, but a little girlish in a way, a little younger than her years in some ways. And so she needs somebody around who is the opposite of that. So her best friend becomes this character, Rhoda, who has a completely different background and a completely different sensibility because she's from the Bronx in New York, and so she has a completely different, and they grew up in the 50s, so it's the Bronx in New York in the 50s, right? And all of those things, and they're very like Mary's character would be more of a, of a wasp, you know what I mean? And
I don't know what that means.
White Anglo-Saxon.
Oh, got it.
Right.
Yeah.
Very like Protestant, very like. And then whereas Rhoda's character, Rhoda's Jewish, Rhoda's more from an urban setting. Everything about her is different. And so she's sort of, in fact, they're the same age, but that character calls Mary kid all the time. Listen, kid. Tell you what, kid.
Super smart.
It's really smart.
We have to go back a step, because when you said Rhoda, and you're like, so you just said, and Rhoda's has to be, pretty much the opposite. Can you explain why? Because I think part of her question is characters sound different.
Right.
Are you just writing the same character over and over again, right? And so you just said that. You said you have this kind of innocent, wasp.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, and then of course Rhoda, her best friend, is completely different. Why of course?
Because you need somebody for... The way that we see anything is through contrast, right? So you need the contrast of those two characters. So Rhoda next to Mary looks probably a little bit more streetwise than she might otherwise look. A little bit more seasoned than she might otherwise look. If she was surrounded by people like her, we wouldn't see her as clearly, right? If Mary was surrounded by people just like her, we wouldn't see Mary as clearly. So they define each other.
Yeah, that's right. It's a room full of Toms with no Jerrys.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
So they define each other. And so if you've got this one, you need this one. When they did the genius of Frasier was giving Frasier the dad they gave him.
Brilliant. Yep.
Right?
The chair, the whole thing.
The whole
really
thing.
Smart.
It's really smart. And on Cheers, I don't even think you ever meet his dad. So
I don't think so.
I don't think so. So they had to create that guy from whole cloth and go, who's Frasier's dad?
Yeah.
What's the best contrast? Mm-hmm. Right?
That's right. I mean, even Cheers is a great example, right?
Yeah.
Because the two, at least let's talk season 1, right? Mm-hmm. Two main characters could not be more different. Mm-hmm. You have the highfalutin, she was dating a professor.
Right.
And then you got, Sam, who's the ex-alcoholic.
Yeah. Yeah. So
you're saying that if you don't get, that's a huge step as far as being able to distinguish your characters.
Yeah.
Right? You have Mary. Cool. How as far away from Mary can I go so that you have contrast? Mm-hmm. And they can play off of each other too.
Right. Yeah. Opposites work really well together. Mm-hmm. Pinky and the Brain.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yep.
Right?
Totally.
They work really well together. So if you
it's
know
Farley and Spade.
Right.
Yeah.
If you know that, it's Laurel and Hardy. Right. Right.
Yeah.
They're visual opposites.
Yep.
So are Farley and Spade, right?
Yeah.
They're borrowing sort of from Laurel and Hardy.
Sure.
Right? One's thin, one's heavier.
Yep.
Right. They're kind of an argument when they show up. Right. Just visually.
Yeah.
They contrast each other.
But if you look at their work, they did all their best work together.
Right.
Because of that contrast.
Right.
Right? And so the reason why Mary's going to work so well is because of Rhoda.
Right. Right. So, and there are other characters that contrast Mary, like her boss at work, Mr. Grant, who's more gruff and, not as diplomatic as Mary is.
Yeah.
And so that you get that contrast with him.
Great
as
character,
well.
too.
Yeah. Really good character.
Yeah.
So, knowing what you're saying and why you've created this main character, right? So Mary, the Mary Tyler Moore Show was done at a time when it was groundbreaking because it was a woman who wasn't married. Before then, all the women on sitcoms had been married, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so she wasn't married, and she was living on her own, and she wasn't necessarily looking for a guy. And, that was all very different, groundbreaking. Like they could barely get something like that on TV. And she was supposed to be divorced in the show, but then the network's like, we can't have divorce. You can't say divorce. So they didn't want a divorce. Anyway, they made it a broken off engagement, but she's all on her own. And so I think that tells you, okay, so this is a new thing, a new experience, a woman all by herself in a city on her own. And so the naive thing made sense for that character. Mm-hmm. Also made sense for that actress, but it made sense for that character.
Yeah.
And so knowing that, we're going to show this woman, and if you watch the show she changes over the course of the show and gets more mature and more, right? So you have to start her off someplace.
Yep.
Right? So you already have a sense of what her character needs to be before you write a word.
Yeah, it's time to grow up and but also maintain some of that innocence because that's also the charm of her. And,
Yeah. But you already know who she has to be. So then you go, okay, well then who will she have the most comedic conflict with? Right.
Yeah. Right.
Her opposite.
Yep. Which is
So you already know that too before you've written a word.
Yep.
About how they talk or how they sound. You already know who they have to be.
Yeah. And when you said a second ago, you said you need to know why you created this character. Can you explain that, Brian, as far as like what you meant by that?
Well, you and I were talking about A Christmas Carol earlier.
Yeah.
Right? So, if you know you're going to take Scrooge from being a guy who is a miser and selfish and all about money,
Yeah.
to a guy who is charitable,
Yeah.
right? Well, okay. So you already know what kind of guy that. Like, you can't make him a different kind of guy,
Yeah.
right? Right?
Yeah.
The more miserly you make him, the more, right? And Dickens goes out of his way to make sure that you know exactly, you know.
Which is the right thing to do, and that's one of the things people are really scared of now. That's why the new Grinch didn't work, right? And because he's not even a Grinch anymore, and he has friends now and stuff. It's like,
Right.
whereas Chuck Jones knew why it was important to make the Grinch such a Grinch,
Right.
Right. Charles Dickens, who apparently was a decent writer, knew why it was so important. That way, you can see the change,
Right.
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 You were having dinner with another director a few weeks ago, and I think, did we talk about this or not? I'm not gonna talk about who it was or whatever, but like, and you guys had that the two things that the two biggest mistakes people make. I think this ties into that. Will you tell that story?
Yeah. I can't remember if we talked about it or not.
I don't remember.
We might have. It doesn't matter.
I think the second point is the most right for them.
So, he was asking me what I thought the biggest mistake people made was, and I said that I thought it was focus, a lack of focus. Most people don't focus. I think we did talk about this, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And he said, I think it's that people won't go there.
Right.
You know, they won't go to that. They won't push it, you know, to its extreme, whatever the thing is. Both things are true, I think.
And so with that, the fact that people won't go there, the contrast, because you could have taken Mary and been like, oh, Rhoda's a little too abrasive, or right. But you go like, you push it out as far as you can, right? The Grinch goes as far one way as like Ebenezer Scrooge goes so far one way where it's like, we can't even put coal on the fire, right?
Right.
And it's like, so you're saying you got to figure out who these characters are so that you can really create that hard contrast.
Yeah. And people are afraid to do. They're afraid to make the Grinch, a Grinch.
Yeah.
They're afraid. Think about how brave it is to create Frasier's dad.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Because the idea that Frasier came from that guy, kind of almost doesn't even make sense. Right.
Yeah.
Like, how did that even happen?
Yeah.
Right. But
of course, in the pilot, they're like, "Oh, well, Mom was more cultured."
Yeah, right. Yeah, they find a way to address and dismiss it, right? But really, it seems difficult to believe, right?
Right.
But it's not hard to believe because it's what the story needs, right?
That's it. Because I was going to say, what's the best thing for Frasier, whether he knows it or not?
That he loosen up and yep.
And so it's like, what's going to make that happen? Like whatever Marty or whatever his name is, right?
Marty.
And so again, you're going like, well, I need Marty if Frasier's going to learn to not be so hoity-toity and right.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about what's the purpose of the character, if you're going, Frasier has to change,
right,
over the course of however many seasons.
Yeah.
Who could actually be the vehicle for something like that?
Right.
And then you're exactly right. It's funny because it works so well, but at the same time, imagine that pitch.
Yeah.
So dad was a cop. He got injured. He has to move in. He has this whole green chair. I think people, if they saw that, they'd be like, that's too much.
Right. Well, yes. I'll give you an example from my own working life, my own career. So I was writing Abe Sapien.
Yeah.
The first Hellboy spinoff, right? So I was writing Abe Sapien, the comic. And it was the first one. And there's a whole thing on a ship. And I knew there was going to be some time without conflict, without any overt conflict. And so one of the tricks you can do if there's not conflict present is you can make a little annoyance. There's a little thing. So if a character's like itching because they've been Poison Ivy the whole time. You know, they're like, okay, tell me now. So, right? So I thought, well, it'd be interesting. I need that. So it'd be interesting if Abe Sapien, who was a fish man, essentially, if he gets seasick. If that's like one of his.
Yeah.
And I could not convince them to do that. They were like, he's a fish guy. I'm like, yeah, that's what's ironic about it. And I even in the book, I say, well, being in the water is different than being on the water. That's the way I address and dismiss it.
Great.
But it was, they were like, no. And they said, you can do it if you have the character take Dramamine so he doesn't get seasick. And then I thought, well, now you've ruined what there's no reason to have it. But they couldn't go.
Just want
there.
everybody to know I took a baby aspirin this morning before I got on the ship. You're like, well,
yeah. So, so then they took the conflict away.
Yeah, and then it was just
then it's just a thing, and they haven't used it since because they didn't listen to what I was saying. They just decided it was a bad idea, so they didn't listen to it. But I think that contrast would have been interesting.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think that's part of the character anymore.
What were you saying? You said they didn't listen to what I was saying.
Well, they didn't listen.
What's the character point you were making?
Well, I needed it. Well, also the thing is to create some frailties. I think that's important, right? Especially with hero characters, they can be too perfect. So to create some frailties, I thought that would be important.
Do you mean like kryptonite, or do you mean more like?
Well, that's one, but it could be. It could be anything. It could be self-doubt. It could be, right? Spider-Man doubts himself all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Batman has frailties, right? Because he can't get over the death of his parents. He's always trying to, right? These things.
You mentioned Miss Piggy's insecure.
Miss Piggy is insecure. Yeah. Right? So these kinds of things can be really helpful to create these sort of frailties. And so I was looking for those kinds of frailties, but they wouldn't go there.
Yeah.
Right? So they pulled off. What if he takes Dramamine so he doesn't get seasick? Well, okay. I don't know why it's in the book anymore.
Yeah. It'd almost be like with Fraser's dad, if you were like, well, why a cop? What if he was like, a struggling art dealer or something? You're like, well, I mean,
yeah.
No, it's not really.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think people are scared of in there? Do you think that they think the contrast is too much?
I think so. I think that well, it depends. Sometimes I think people don't give an idea enough thought. So they go with their knee-jerk, which is, that's not right. Fraser's dad couldn't be that guy. Their knee-jerk tells them no. They haven't taken it in and said, why is this person who seems to know what they're doing pitching something to me that seems like a bad idea? Am I not hearing the idea correctly?
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? They don't do that. They just go, no, right? If I'm working with an actor and I'm directing and they have an idea and they go, I've got an idea, I tell them not to tell me. Let's do it. Because if I hear it, if you tell me and I hear it and I misinterpret it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Right? And say, no, I might be cutting off a bad idea. So just do it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, don't tell me.
That's awesome. I like that.
Yeah, so.
Because either way, you're going to see it.
Right.
It'll work or it won't.
Yeah. Who cares? Let's try it.
Yeah. Why debate it?
Yeah. And I don't want to I might mishear it or misinterpret it.
Yeah, that's great.
Right? So I think sometimes people don't go that extra step and go, am I hearing it wrong? Am I picturing it wrong?
Yeah.
Right? It's one thing when it's done. It's one thing to see Fraser's dad when it's all done and it's a show.
Yeah.
When you're conceiving the idea.
Yeah. It's a big. I can't believe. It's funny. You're exactly right. It's funny, Brian, because when I think about it, I was like, I can't believe they let that go.
Yeah, it's exactly
great. It's like one of the best things in the show.
Yeah,
especially because he and Niles are so similar. Imagine if Dad was too.
Right.
It's like, and then if the live-in house nanny or whatever. It's like they're so good at their jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, that show's no joke, man. We're talking about Cheers or Frasier or something. People, it was funny. I didn't share we got the same question we always get from a couple of people, which is, Brian, why don't you talk about new shows and movies? And it's like, or you could watch Frasier.
Right.
Or you could listen to, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, there's other possibilities.
Yeah.
Because, like, all these folks, well, the funny thing is you're talking about Mary Tyler Moore.
Yeah.
You're talking about the people that did Mary Tyler Moore and all these shows are so interconnected with different talent and stuff. It was people that really knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
But when you sit down and you go, okay, I know my armature, right? Now the funny thing is, instead of like, who would be some cool characters, it sounds like you're going, who are the characters I have to have?
Right. Yeah, who do I have to have? That's everything, right? That's how you do it. Well, who needs to be in this story? I need a character like this. Okay. And they will, if you listen to that, if you listen to your story, you know, like, okay, I'm telling a story about X, a guy who learns the meaning of Christmas, right? I need a guy who doesn't know the meaning of Christmas, right? You already know that. You don't have to know how that person talks. They could talk anyway. You don't have to know how they talk. You don't have to know any of that stuff. You just have to know their function. And then that tells you who they butt up against. So the guy who works for Scrooge, Cratchit, is a nice guy, a timid guy, a generous guy.
Loves his kids.
Loves his kids, right? A happy guy despite having nothing.
Yeah.
Scrooge is unhappy despite having everything. Like, it tells you, the story tells you what to do.
Yeah. It's so funny because I think maybe it sounds deceiving in that when you explain other people's work, they're really good. You're like, yeah, obviously.
Right.
But we were talking about it earlier today. It's like, once you try to do it, do you know how hard it is to elegantly, like coming up with Marty Crane is insanely difficult. Or Mary and like coming up with that. You know, the contrast helps a ton, but still, like, once you can explain it logically, like we're breaking it down, but boy, there's a big difference between that and sitting in a writer's room going, okay, we have Frasier. What else we got? Right?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, who should be around him? No, that's hard. It's hard. That's why a roadmap helps.
What do you mean by that?
Well, instead of saying who should be around instead of who could be around Frasier, it's who should be around Frasier. And that's
great.
You know?
Yeah,
well,
I like that.
Who do we need?
Yes.
We need this person because he needs to have that, and we need this person because he needs, you know, who does Mary need? Well, if Mary is alone in the big city, and she's very polite, she needs people who are abrasive around her. She needs people who are more direct around her. You know, that's what she needs. That's what she's going to butt up against, and that's what's going to force her to change eventually. But in the meantime, then
you got it at home, you got it at work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You know, if you look at MASH, right, you have there's all kinds of contrast. Hawkeye's the main character, but you get all kinds of contrast that help you see Hawkeye differently, that main character. And he also illuminates those characters. So for instance, when Charles Burns shows up later in the run, he's Frasier.
Right.
You know, right. You know, and in the army, you know what I mean? And so he's also contrasting with the army in some ways. Right. But he's Frasier in the army, and so that's completely different than Hawkeye, who's Groucho Marx in the army, right? And so the guy who's really uptight taking it very seriously, and the guy who's not taking it seriously so he can get through it, right? That's a contrast.
Absolutely. There's so much good contrast in that show.
It's amazing. Radar's a great Radar on that show. People haven't seen these shows probably. They should. But Radar, I really like Radar. I think the show tanked when Radar left. And because Radar was kind of like with Mary, he was the child.
Yeah.
Not that Mary was a child. She wasn't really a child. But this guy was a child.
Yeah.
And
the glasses and smaller and all that, is that right?
And he was the guy everybody on the show protected.
Yeah. That's good.
He was the guy everybody he was the heart of that show.
Innocent.
Yeah. And he was the part of he almost represented the innocence that people were trying to hold on to because war is so harsh.
Man, so smart.
Radar's amazing on that show. when I was younger, when it was on, I was like, oh yeah, Radar, because he's not the funniest or the, you know. But when I got older and rewatched it, I was like, Radar's genius, because he is that. Everybody protects Radar. It's really nice.
Gosh, it's perfect for the setting too. I mean, it's
because here you have Radar really is also a stand-in for the audience. Like most of us, some people have been to war, but a lot of us haven't.
Yeah.
And even if those people who've been to war or been in a war zone, there was a time when they hadn't been.
Yeah.
So he sort of stands in for us, like, hey, this is crazy. This is, he has the real emotions about things.
Yeah.
Where other people have to be hardened or whatever.
Or you got Klinger or somebody that's more out there. Like, they were all so unique and distinct too.
Yeah.
Right? Because the hard part is if they're standing next to each other and they look the same, it's really hard to be like, you ever watch a show like that where you're like, wait, was that the aunt or is that the mom? They're so similar, I don't even know the difference.
Yeah. They haven't made a big enough distinction between those characters. So anyway, so that's the first, I think, order of business. Figure out why.
Who do they have to be surrounded by?
Yeah. And then I think the thing that people don't do, you know what? It's listening. People, if you're a writer or a storyteller, you should be observant. That's really your job. That's your whole job, is to be observant, to understand how people operate, to understand or try to understand people's motivations, how people operate when they have power, how people operate, what are they frightened of when they have power, why is somebody with power mean, or why, right? These kinds of things, to try to figure those things out and get inside people. So you have to be observant, because you're not really creating characters out of nothing, right? You're creating characters based on all of your experiences and people you've met and people you've known and stories you've heard.
Can you tell me about a character you wrote that you pulled something personal from your life, like in one of your books or one of the graphic novels, or I don't know, just to help illustrate that?
Yeah, well, in Freeman, the Western I wrote, which, I stopped printing the book, so maybe we can find it. Maybe you can't.
It's really good, yeah.
Thanks. People like it, but nobody wants to make the movie. But anyway, but I wrote this screenplay, and it's a Western, and the character is had been a slave. So it takes place after slavery, and the character has a history where he had been a slave and sort of has some PTSD around it. But how he felt about the trajectory of his life, I put a lot of what I was feeling at that moment in that guy. The fact that he was, I spent a lot of my career being dismissed. Mm-hmm. Like I said, like not heard, or I'm the kind of guy who comes in and says, what if Marty's Fraser's dad? And everybody goes, really, Brian? That's really what has happened to me a lot over the years. So I understood that kind of dismissal that he was feeling. But that was personal. So that was very personal. I think that on some level, all characters are you on some level. If they're true, even the characters you hate should be you on some level. Because otherwise you're judging those characters, and when you judge those characters, you write cartoons.
That's good.
So if you don't judge them, the audience will judge them. You don't have to judge them. If you understand why the greedy person's greedy, if you can understand that, you'll write a character versus a caricature.
Reminds me of the werewolf stuff. Did we ever talk about that on the show?
I don't know.
We were talking to our buddy Victor about characters, like drawing characters.
Yeah.
And it stemmed from the question you asked me one time. You were like, have you ever met a vampire? Have we never talked about this?
Oh, maybe.
And I was like, I knew that it was a trick question, right? I was like, I don't know, Brian.
It wasn't a trick question.
But I knew that it was like, how do I answer this? And you're like, yes, you have. You met vampires. Who are the people that kind of like suck the life out of? And it was like, oh, that's interesting. And you're like, all those monsters are based on real things.
Right.
Right? You ever met a zombie before?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're alive, but they're dead?
Yeah.
You know, and I think on the werewolf one, where it went was, right now people sit down and draw a werewolf, and pretty much they all try to draw the same looking werewolf.
Right.
You know, it probably goes back to just the classic monster,
right
movie. And then the idea that we were talking to our friend Victor about was, how much better do you think like, if you just sat down and drew the werewolf, and then you actually went away for an evening, and for 2 or 3 hours, you really just sat with yourself and thought about all the times you turned into this monster. You went from who you are, and maybe you lashed out at something, at a person or something, and you were ashamed of it later, and you almost go like, where'd that monster come from?
Right.
And once you realize that I'm a werewolf,
right,
now draw the werewolf.
Right.
And how much better and more interesting that drawing of a werewolf would be, because you realize that we're all kind of a werewolf, right?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Instead of just being like, oh, werewolves look like this. It's like,
right.
Figure out the inside of the werewolf.
Yep.
And I it just came to mind when you were talking about, you have to, at some level, go, well, no, I mean, they're people, and there's a piece of me in this, right?
Right. So that's the other thing. And the other thing is, and I don't like talking about dialogue for a lot of reasons, but a lot of with dialogue and characters, because she asked specifically about how to make people sound
different. Yeah.
Well, you have to listen, right? They call it having an ear for dialogue, right? You have to listen, and you have to listen. You know what I've noticed is sometimes people listen with judgment. So if they think somebody is uneducated and they don't speak properly or whatever, and they are judging them when they write them, then that, again, looks like a caricature.
Yeah.
Right? Instead, you can listen and hear the music in their speech. You can hear, like, oh, that's a really interesting pattern. That's an interesting speech pattern.
Yeah.
Right? And when you start thinking like that, you can look past this superficial, how they're talking on the surface.
Yeah.
Right? And get to... You can write in fact, I did that in Freeman, that thing we're talking about, right? I wrote a guy from the middle of the mountains in Appalachia, right? Who would be perceived by many people as kind of a hick and a redneck, and
he was stinking smart.
He was really smart, right? That didn't have anything to do. How he spoke had nothing to do with who he was.
Yeah, that's cool. So through the actions is how you showed how brilliant he was.
Yeah,
like the pepper thing you did for anybody who ends up reading it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
like that was great.
Yeah. So
even, what was his name?
His name was Cage.
And what was his job?
He had been a... So the Freeman is basically the deal on Freeman is about a guy who had been a slave years before, who is accused of a crime he didn't commit, and uses the techniques he used to run away from slavery to escape the people chasing him for this crime he didn't commit. But what they do is they hire a guy who had been a slave catcher, which was a job that poor whites could get in the South because there were slaves with, so if you're a poor white person in the South during slavery, you had almost nothing because there was free labor everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So you could do things like you could be the overseer on a plantation, or you could be a slave hunter, things like that, slave catcher. And so that he's a slave catcher. He's a poor white guy who's a slave catcher.
But what I love about that is, like, when you read the script, you don't notice in a good way things like that. You just read it and you're like, oh, that's cool. And then you're like, oh, damn, you named that guy Cage? That's great. It's an example of the Marty thing you're talking about, where you're like, I was like, well, what does he do? He hunts people down and, puts them let's call the guy Cage. It just feels right. Mm-hmm. But later on, you go like, oh, that's the best name for that character.
Sure.
But it doesn't stand out on the page. It's invisible. It's invisible ink. But I thought it's like exactly your point, where you're like, yeah, I keep telling people, just if it's Frasier, give him Marty.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, if there's this slave catcher, his name's Cage, and he's actually brilliant.
Right.
Even though he doesn't talk that way. But it makes the character so much more interesting when he talks the way he talks in your script, but then you see him breaking down how to track someone down, and you're like, wow, that's brilliant. That contrast you built in makes the character so much more interesting. Mm-hmm. And it's also the perfect character to go after him.
Right. And his name is?
Freeman.
Freeman.
I know, man. It's so good.
Well, Freeman is a name that slaves often took after slavery.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's an actual name they took.
Huh.
They were called freemen or freedmen after the war to sort of, these were people who were slaves. So Freeman was a name that people often took. So I knew that. So his name was Freeman. The last thing he wanted, because he has PTSD from slavery, is to be chained up and locked up again. So who's after him? Cage.
It's so good, dude.
Yeah. Well.
But the funny thing is, like, if you just read it, for somebody who has read it, none of that stuff stands out. But it all feels like, it's like music. You're not hearing one note that's like, you know what I mean, standing out. It's just like, it flows, and then you'll be like, looking at it and be like, oh, God damn it. Like, of course he put the name in the, you know what I mean? It's that kind of stuff you're thinking about later, and you're like, dang it, the pepper thing. But that's great, because the contrast you built between those characters, to the point where it's like, I don't know how you would have done it any other way. Same type of thing. You're like, well, yeah, of course.
Right, once it's done.
Yeah, once it's done.
Yeah.
But when you have Freeman and Cage, can you talk about, this is a great example, right? Freeman and where he's at, and then you invented Cage. How did you get to Cage? In the same way, how do you think they went from Mary Tyler Moore to Rhoda, right? Like, how did you go from Freeman to Cage?
Well, I tried to figure out, what I needed was, you need a formidable villain, right? Mm-hmm. So Cage is not just a slave catcher. He's the best slave catcher. He was the best slave catcher. That's who he has to be. Well, what would make you the best slave catcher? What I created in that character, first of all, I knew he was poor. I knew how he was going to talk. I knew he was poor and he was from the South at this time, and I knew how he was going to speak. So it's like, okay, so that contrast was just built in. The contrast that he would be intelligent and that he would have this way of speaking. Great. Right? That was built in. I needed a character. The reason that Cage is good at his job is because when everybody else is dismissing these slaves as subhuman, as not as intelligent, and all of those things, those people aren't good slave catchers. I wanted a guy who understood he was hunting a human being. That's what made him good. So he was strangely more enlightened, right, in some ways than other people. It was just the job he did. Yeah. But he understood he was hunting another human being. He also understood, as I think, when I was writing him, he's a guy whose intelligence is dismissed all the time because of the way he speaks. Yeah. So he understands that that's not true. Like, just because everybody thinks someone is not smart doesn't mean they're not smart. Yeah. Right? So he has sort of some inside knowledge, some insider knowledge. Like, now, these are human beings just like you and me. They're smart just like you and me. And so unless you understand how smart your prey is, you're not going to catch them. Right? And so that's what made him good. So there was also some contrast within him where he understood. He didn't think, that character doesn't think black people are subhuman. Yeah. Right? Uh-huh. That character, so even though there are other people who, on the surface, you would think would be more enlightened, they think, oh, well, they're subhuman.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so that's where he came from. He came from this, I needed a really smart slave catcher, and I needed to figure out what would make him smart, what would make him better than the other. Yeah.
And it's also not cliche. Like, I know Hitchcock always talked about cliche, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're like, yeah, you could have how could a dumb guy catch somebody like Freeman? Right. Right? But I think a lot of people would have just been like, oh, just get the kind of typical, dumb bounty hunter. But it makes it so much more interesting when you built the contrast like that. And so was it the same type of thing where you go, okay, I have Freeman. Who does he have to be surrounded by? Who has to be the one that tries to hunt him down?
Yeah. That's what I did. Mm-hmm. And then Cage came out of that, right? It's almost, if you understand what the characters are for, then you don't have to do that much in terms of creation. Yeah. You just have to respond, right? Well, if this character's this way, I need this. Yeah. Again, I'm going to talk about an old TV show, but on the Andy Griffith show. So Andy Griffith, the comic, the actor, was a stand-up comic. He told a lot of stories and stuff, right? He was a funny guy.
Matlock, if you ever stayed home sick from school.
So he was a funny guy, known for being a funny guy. That's how he became a big star, and he got a TV show. And when he got his TV show, he was supposed to be this funny Southern small town sheriff. He was friends with Don Knotts, another actor. And Don Knotts called him after the show aired and said, I saw
Apple
your
Dumpling Gang, if you've ever seen the episode. I'm trying to contextualize.
Yeah, right. Mr. Furley.
Yeah.
Anyway, Don Knotts knew Andy, and he called him after the pilot, and he said, hey, I saw your show. It's pretty good. Don't you need a deputy? And that's how he got his job. So they wrote him as the deputy. So he became the deputy. And it wasn't long before Andy...
Famous character.
He won.
About as iconic as you can get for a sidekick.
Yeah, and I think he won an Emmy every year he played that character.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I can see that.
I think he won an Emmy every year he played that.
But it's the same thing. Talk about the contrast between those characters.
Well, that's just it.
Yeah.
So that's just it. Andy, who was funny, after a couple of episodes it was clear to me that Don needed to be the funny one.
Yeah.
And I needed to be the straight one. I needed to be the contrast.
And so we gave up that spot.
Yeah, he gave up the...
But it also allowed us, Don Knotts' character, to be so much bigger and iconic, right? Like his silhouette as a character.
Yeah.
It's like as soon as he starts sniffing and he's holding his holster, you go like, I've seen that before. Even if you don't know the show.
Yeah.
That's how iconic it was. But it allowed Andy to move into a position, this kind of fatherly position.
Yeah.
Which he slays.
Yeah, he does.
Right?
Yeah.
And what did he say? He talked about characters and jokes, right?
Oh, well, yes. He said that if a joke makes a liar out of the character, then lose the joke. Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, one of the best pieces of writing you could get, because he was saying you always have to be telling the truth. The problem is if you go, well, this is so funny.
Yeah.
But the character would never say that, or this is so funny, or the character would never do that. You might get a laugh, maybe. But if you get that laugh, you have also lost credibility. The audience doesn't.
Yeah, there'll never be depth.
Yeah.
It's like Family Guy.
Yeah.
You don't have to comment on that. But I'm just saying, because I know your friends or whatever. But like I'm just saying, but that's why that show will never have the depth of The Simpsons, right? Because they just go for the gag every time,
right?
Whereas there's nothing there. Well, there's some episodes of The Simpsons that'll wreck you.
That's true.
Right?
That's true. Yes. Especially early on.
Yeah.
There's some amazing ones. Yeah.
But I'm just saying, and so like he's thinking. So going back to the original question around character. It's like, well, that's another thing. So you have to look at the contrast. You have to, well, figure out, okay, who does this person have to be surrounded by, right? And then you got to figure out your contrast,
right?
So you can actually see the difference,
right?
Right? There's a difference between a penny and a quarter, right? Oh, okay, got it. I can see the difference. And then you go, cool. How do I tell the truth?
Right.
Because that's really what you're talking about now. I mean, and I think it's in Invisible Ink. You said that in order to affect people deeply, you have to tell the truth.
Right.
Can you talk about why? What do you mean by the truth when it pertains to like characters, right? Because I mean, for me, when I read that, I was like, "That's dynamite." But I don't think people might necessarily know exactly what you mean by that.
Okay, so okay, I hate to name drop on the show, but so my friend August Wilson wrote a play called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. It's the first play he ever had on Broadway. And I had read it, but I'd never seen it performed, and it was being performed, and I went to see it. And August knew I was going to see it, so the next day I saw August, and he goes, "Hey, what'd you think of the show, man?" And I said, "Well, I thought the woman who played Ma Rainey was too big." And he goes, he mentioned a famous actress who had played that role, who also did that. I won't say her name. And he's like, "Yeah, she did that." And he agreed with me, and it was because in the story, it takes place in the 20s, and Ma Rainey's she's a jazz singer, and she comes in to the studio, and she's kind of demanding all these things in the play. I want this. I can't remember, but it's like Coca-Cola, and they didn't get her Coca-Cola. It's like I said, she's kind of throwing her weight around, and they keep wanting her to sign the contract so they can do the recording. And eventually it comes to, you realize, the I can't remember exactly how it comes out, but essentially she knows that once she signs the contract, she has no power. So she's taking all her power up front, getting what she needs up front, because once she signs her life away, she won't have any power.
Yeah.
Right? So I thought that the actress playing that part, the production I saw, didn't act like a person with power. People who are really powerful don't do much.
It's so true. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the truth. They don't do much.
Yeah.
Because they have power. It's the people without power who are screaming and yelling.
Yeah.
Right?
That is so true.
Right? That's the truth. Right? Observe people with power. You'll see they don't do anything. Because they don't have to.
It's like in Goodfellas, where he's talking about the main mob boss, and he goes, he didn't move fast or whatever because he didn't have to, right?
Yeah.
He didn't move for anybody. It's like, well, he didn't have to.
Right.
It was the young guys that were going out doing all the crimes, and
Yeah.
it's like, right?
Yeah.
Remember, there's a couple scenes where like you look, he just glances at people and they like,
Yeah.
slow down. Like that's what it's like.
Yeah. Which size dog is more likely to keep barking at you?
Yeah.
This one, the little one, the teeny one.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Yeah.
they don't have any actual power.
Right.
Right? It's the same thing.
And so you're like, she didn't understand the truth of the character.
She didn't understand the nature of power. Right? Power doesn't have to do anything. You can own power just by not doing anything.
Yeah.
Right? So, and you would know that. Like if you went into a place of business and everybody's running around and there's one person just sitting in a chair not doing anything but looking confident, you go, well, that's the person in charge. You would know it.
Yeah.
You know what power looks like.
Yeah, you're late to a meeting in a scene, and everybody's like, we're late, and they don't even address it. There's like,
Yeah.
they stop, they pour their coffee, walk in. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
that contrast is huge.
Yeah.
But man, it's amazing. So like, if it's so funny that August was like, yeah, that he's like, yeah, they just didn't get it.
Right. Yeah. But that is a way to think about. So that's the truth, I guess. That's the kind of, that's a truth,
Yeah.
right? It seems small, but I can't tell you how often I'll watch what was I watching? I was watching a movie, I won't say which one, and this character is supposed to be unattractive. But the actress is a movie star and looks like a movie star.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, why are you lying to me? They were saying she weighed too much. And I'm like, why are you? I can't believe anything that happens now because you're lying to me. This actress doesn't have an ounce of fat on her, but you're just like, well, she's huge. I'm like, you're lying. So I can't trust you now.
Yeah.
You're going to lie. You're going to lie because you have, you think it's okay to keep lying to me. But now I am less and less and less invested every time you tell a lie.
I told you, well, hell with it. Like, that was one of my, with Toy Story 4, as soon as they did a cutaway, and there was like two characters that, look like they're going to like attack an old lady or whatever. And then it cuts and it's like, if that didn't happen, I was like, I'm out. When did we start doing these cutaways? Right. Now I'm like, now I don't ever know what's a cutaway or not.
Right.
It was like same problem I had with the Star Wars movie or whatever, when it started with a bunch of jokes, right? Where it's like, is the intercom working? And there's like, yes, whatever. You're talking to the bad guys and you should be scared. I'm still on hold here or whatever. It's like, that's it. I'm done.
Yeah.
Because it's in the first minute of the movie. I'm like, well, now I can't take it's Star Wars. It's not a Marvel movie.
Right.
It was like, once you break the trust of the audience, you're like, oh, all of a sudden Jedis can magic themselves to other planets. And like Leia can fly through space after getting blown up and it's fine. It's like, oh, if you read the appendix of the fourth novel, it's like, nope, I can't. Because once it's like, there's no up, there's no down.
Yeah.
It's, you do that with the audience, you lose the audience.
Right.
And so, like, how do the characters tell the truth? It's Scarface, right? He goes, I always tell the truth even when I lie. Right.
One of the things that I like so much about T2. I can go on and on about Terminator 2 and how much I...
Well, here's the thing. People want us to talk about new movies. We're talking about new movies now.
Is that new?
Right? I'm talking about the ones I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, but T2, go on. I could listen to T2 all day long.
Well, the fact that Sarah Connor becomes a Terminator, the fact that Sarah Connor becomes exactly the thing she hates, that her hate and her fear turned her into what she hates, right? She hates a Terminator. What does a Terminator do? The Terminator comes to kill her because of something she has yet to do, right?
Yep.
Right? And that's what she becomes. She becomes a killing machine, and she goes to kill Dyson.
Yeah.
Because he's going to do something in the future, right?
Yep.
She's a Terminator.
Think about how they introduced her in the first movie, right?
Right.
What's she doing?
She's at her job.
She's at her job, and it's kind of like, it's got kind of, even like color correction wise, it's kind of got a brown tones, and it's like kind of, the way they introduce her in T2, she's in her cell. She's doing pull-ups.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like got that blue it's like, God, he's really good at his job.
Yeah.
So, and then you go like, oh, wait, what happened to Sarah while we were gone?
Right, yeah.
She became the thing she hates.
Right.
That contrast is insane. And then what position does the Terminator take?
Right, he's in the other...
savior.
Yeah. I know. Don't
get out of here.
It's crazy.
People see that stuff and they're like, oh, I didn't notice that. It's like, but that's why it works.
Yeah.
Is because they're that smart.
Right. So the truth is, that is always a danger, becoming the thing you hate.
Yep.
That's the truth.
Yep.
Right? That your hate and your fear and all of those things can drive you to become the very thing that you hate.
Yep.
That's the truth of it.
It's it's Star Wars. So we're talking about the first, like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Right? That's what Luke had to face.
Right. So that's a real thing. So even though the surface of it isn't true, robots and whatever.
Yeah, sure.
The core of it is true.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So always telling the truth with your characters and with your situations. I see people all the time. Jaws.
Here we go.
Jaws.
So Jaws is a movie about...
Here's the thing about Jaws that you almost never see anymore. Saw it in Aliens, actually, which is that guy whose job it is to get the shark wants to do anything but that. Because that's the truth.
So true.
Right? Now, the hero couldn't be happier to go into harm's way. Let me strap on my guns and let's go. Right?
Yeah.
But that's not the way the world works. Like, I don't want to go out there.
Yeah.
That's a shark. Do you see that thing? You see what that thing can do?
Yeah.
Plus, that character in Jaws is afraid of the water.
Yeah, but that's what's true, right?
Right.
And you're like, what did Martin Luther King want to do as a job?
You want to be a teacher. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, study great people. Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, if you think about it, you go like, oh, they never wanted... They had to rise to the occasion.
Right.
They were like, I just wanted... Man, I want to hang out with my kids.
Right.
I want to do... Right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you go like, but what's incredible is that in spite of their comfort, not having the comfort, they did it when they were scared. They did it, right?
Right. So the truth of the matter is you will be scared when you have to do these big things. You will be scared.
Totally.
Right? That's the truth.
Yeah.
Right? So so that's why the truth is important, because now you can identify.
Yeah.
You can identify with Ripley in Aliens because she does not want to go where there are aliens.
Yep.
She's not all gung-ho. In fact, the people who are gung-ho, the Marines, right, they learn a harsh lesson. Right? You know?
I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
That's
right?
a harsh lesson.
Right? But she's like, no, these things are crazy. I don't want to go out there. Like, she resists and resists, right?
Yeah.
So that's a little off topic. So, but anyway, but
there's also contrast there with the characters.
That's what I was going to say. So what we can't talk about, though, is who Ripley is, right, versus who the Marines are.
Yeah, that's right.
They couldn't be more confident.
Yeah.
They couldn't be more cocky.
Yeah.
They couldn't be more self-assured. She's like, you have no idea what these things are like, and then believe me, you wouldn't want to be there. So she's only going, she's going to do what she can to help, but she does not want to be there. Yeah. And because she doesn't want to be there, it's actually more emotional than most things get now, because you feel her fear with her.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh yeah, you feel it.
Yeah.
It's
it's huge. It'd be like if Andy was like, I really want to go to Shawshank Prison.
Right. Yeah.
You're like,
yeah, right.
You got to force, because in real life, we are forced into growth.
Right.
Right? Most of us are like, man, I hope something really awful happens so I can learn that I can handle it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like these things happen. You look back and it's like, that was a bad thing, but I'm glad it happened because it's how I learned that I could blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That's why it works in the show, too, because it's true.
Right. So anyway, yeah. So again, knowing who Ripley has to be,
Yep.
you know what the contrasting characters have to be.
Yeah.
Right? So that kind of stuff, that kind of character work comes out of what you're trying to say.
And he even was able to define the Marines from each other, too.
Mm-hmm. It's true. That's true.
I mean, the craziest one is the Wizard of Oz, right? When we're talking about characters.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
right,
like, that's like the best example of what you're saying. That they just pop, right? You know what I mean? Where you go like, okay, we have Dorothy.
Right.
Who does Dorothy have to be surrounded by?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's amazing. So not only that, so you figure out who she needs to be surrounded by, right? So if the armature of the Wizard of Oz is that you may already have what you're looking for, then the characters surrounding her are characters who also already have what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Dorothy's looking for some place better than home.
Yeah.
Right? But she has everything she needs at home. Even the same friends, right?
Yep.
Essentially are at home as in Oz. But you have a character who doesn't think he has a brain, right? So what you do with that character is you make him a brainiac, right? He's got all the ideas. He's got all the plans. You make that character a brainiac because that character already has what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. So then you know who his character has to be. Who does the Tin Man have to be? Well, he has to be sensitive. He doesn't think he has a heart, so he has to be sensitive. He's crying all the time. He's sensitive. Right?
Yeah.
Well, who does the Lion need to be? Well, he needs to think he doesn't have courage, but he needs to do courageous things all the time. It just tells you.
I know, it's just depressing because these people are... The people love The Wizard of Oz. Once you see that, my God, these people are good at their job.
They were very good at their job.
And there's a reason why... I can't imagine how many times that's still watched every single day.
I know.
Around the world.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be crazy. It's like, it was Halloween last month. How many little kids dressed up someone from The Wizard of Oz to this day?
Yeah, 1939, that movie was made.
But if it was a pitch meeting, and you're like, what if the guy who doesn't have a brain is actually a brainiac and actually does all the plans for the whole movie? People will be like, that's too much, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like, but man, once you see it working, you go, wow, that is so well done.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's crazy.
It is crazy. It is crazy. So I want to get to talk a little bit about the voices of characters.
Yeah.
Because there are some tricks, I think.
Okay.
One is, if you're writing a character, depending on what the character needs, so this is an abstraction because I'm just making characters out of whole cloth, but if you say, well, I'm going to make this character, like, first of all, age has something to do with the way people speak, right? How old is this character versus this character? That has something to do with how people speak.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
A young person talks, somebody who's 20 talks completely differently, right?
Yeah, somebody's 80.
Somebody's 80.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? The person who's 80 is going to use, if they use slang at all, it's going to be much older slang, right? We had a swell time. You know what I mean? Or whatever, right? So you already know this person sounds different from that person, but you can do that with education. Right? This person has this education, this person has that education. Again, you can't judge it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you can do that. You can, where are they from? Mm-hmm. Right? Somebody from, well, again, Mary Richards' character, Mary Richards is from the Midwest, right? And Rhoda's from the Bronx.
It's such a great. It's
right.
Yeah.
So you already have different speech patterns.
Yep.
Right. So there are all these things you can do to get a sense of the way a character speaks. You know, I mean, you're going to have certain needs and requirements for a character, but there are all these things, and if you listen, you'll hear how differently people speak. You can hear it, you know. Even among people that you would think speak the same way, there's slight differences.
Yeah.
You know, in the way they speak. But you have to develop an ear. You have to listen. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do it. It doesn't come out of nowhere. The problem most people have with dialogue, every single person, I think every single person I've ever met, or not even met, who says they're good with dialogue, or people say they're good with dialogue, they're always good at one kind of dialogue. All their characters sound exactly the same.
What do you think they mean by good dialogue?
They mean clever, or the people are smart. You know, they mean funny. You know, they mean poignant. They mean all these things. Mm-hmm. They don't mean, you know, that was a really clear, invisible way to get out exposition, right? Now we have information that we need as an audience, but we didn't even know that was happening. People almost never call that good dialogue, right? They always say something calls attention to itself as good dialogue, which is exactly the opposite of how I feel. Yeah. Right? Like, well, all I'm really doing is saying, look how clever that writer is. That's all I'm doing right now. Yeah. That was really clever of that writer to come up with that line. Right? Instead of now, there's some clever, really good dialogue in things, like Billy Wilder did a lot of that. But Billy Wilder would get at the truth, right? And I think I mentioned it once before on the show, but it's one of my favorite lines in all of movies, and I don't like quoting lines, or I don't like focusing on lines because I think it's a surface issue. Mm-hmm. Usually it comes out of context. So the line is good because of the context, generally. But in The Apartment, where Shirley MacLaine is having an affair with Fred McMurray, with her boss. She's having an affair with this guy, and it's around Christmas time, and he has to leave because he's got a thing with his family. And she's wiping her eyes, and she says, I should know by now, something like this. I should know by now that a woman in love with a married man shouldn't wear mascara. Yeah.
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 Yeah, he was really good at his job.
He was very good.
Yeah.
So,
I thought you were going to talk about Double Indemnity. There's some stuff in Double Indemnity that, like...
Yeah.
It's crazy, man.
Yeah.
But it's all motivated.
Right. Right. And that tells you something about her.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't tell you, oh, look, when you hear that, you hear a truth.
Yep.
You don't hear how clever of Billy Wilder. You hear a truth.
Yep.
Right? So that's how powerful the truth can be. Mm-hmm. That's one of those lines. It's unbelievable. It's devastating. Never
try to write it.
Try to write it, for one thing. And you never hear it quoted.
Totally.
You never hear it quoted.
Yeah.
Because it's so perfect for that piece.
And so integrated.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Man. Once you start to see how well it's like music, right? And you're like, oh, man. It's like, it's like, I don't know, I didn't grow up with like classical music or anything like that. And then you're with somebody who like really understands Mozart, and they'll like explain it to you, and you'll be like, oh, wow,
yeah.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't know music could be like that. Mm-hmm. It's that stuff. Once you can start to see that, you go like, oh my God.
Yeah.
He was so good at his job.
Yeah.
You know? To the point where it feels effortless. It's totally integrated. It doesn't stand out, but it's perfect.
Yeah.
You know, it's like a Spielberg camera move. You don't even notice it.
Right.
And that's why it's so good.
Yeah. Yeah. And the few times people with Spielberg, the few times they do notice, then they go, see, he's a hack, even though they saw 100 shots before then that they didn't notice.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
Yeah, don't get me started.
What's the biggest mistake people make when writing characters?
Judging them. It's the same mistake people make when they're acting, too. They judge their character. And it creates a cartoony performance, and it creates a cartoony character on the page. If you write the character and you have no empathy for them at all, it becomes something you're very distant from those characters, and it's not something just doesn't resonate, and it becomes a cartoon you can't get invested in the same way. So that's a huge mistake when writing characters. The other thing is not differentiating characters so that they sound different. That was a hard thing for me to learn how to do. I spent a long time learning how to do it because when I was starting out, you turn something in or hand something to somebody and they'd say, all your characters sound the same. And at first I thought, well, what's wrong with that? People who are in the same neighborhood, people are going to talk the same way. And, for a long time I fought that. But then I started trying to figure out how to do it. One of the best ways I learned how to do it was writing spec scripts.
Huh.
When I wrote spec scripts, like I wrote a Star Trek, and I wrote the thing about Star Trek, the original Star Trek, is that I probably shouldn't have been writing an original Star Trek because it was off the air, but I was learning, and you learn what those characters do. So well, Kirk's this guy, right? So he doesn't sound like McCoy and he doesn't sound like Spock. And when I learned by imitating other
totally
writers.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so it's like, oh, that's cool. So all I have to do is that. And I also learned a lot from Stan Lee.
Well, how? In what way?
Well, the Fantastic Four sort of fallen out of favor because I think they haven't been doing it ever since. It used to be really great. And I think the Fantastic Four is really the first superhero team I ever was aware of. Like, they had a cartoon when I was a kid. And so I used to watch that cartoon all the time. But those characters all sound very different. And so when I started reading the comics, the character of Ben Grimm has this sort of gruff way of talking, whereas Reed Richards has, he's a scientist.
Yeah.
He has a different way of talking. Everybody has a different way. Johnny's the kid. He has a different way of talking. And seeing that on the page really taught me a lot about, like, oh, they've got to sound different like they do in the Fantastic Four. Or like Spider-Man has a voice. He has a character. And he doesn't sound like the other people on the page, And that actually taught me a lot. Comic books taught me a lot, particularly Stan Lee's writing.
He was pretty good at what he did.
He was pretty good. He was pretty good. Now, everybody else who came behind him they were just imitating, people came behind him and wrote the Fantastic Four and they did a good job.
Yeah.
But he,
setting the standard, right? It's almost like doing the pilot, right? It's like when you can set that is so stinking hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've talked before about like what goes into actually putting together a pilot that is good enough that it has all the information you need to be able to run for like whatever.
Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah.
And you have one pilot and like, oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah, it has to have all the elements.
I think you were talking about The Fugitive or something. You're like, and so you have one episode.
Yeah.
And it needs to be able to run for like a season or 10.
Right, yeah.
And I'm like, wow, man.
Yeah. And The Fugitive television show ran for a long time. A lot of episodes of that show.
Yeah. But what's cool too is like you've talked about one of the greatest, playwrights in American history tonight. You've talked about Stan Lee. Mm-hmm. You've talked about, movies like The Wizard of Oz. You've also talked about Terminator. Like, what's cool is you're learning stuff all over the place.
Right.
You're like, you're learning stuff from August and Stan and Rod and Billy and, it's like, man, the cool thing is like, as you're on your journey to learn how to, for the folks that were asking questions about the writing for characters, it's like, you can get this inspiration as long as you're ingesting good stuff.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting about Rod Serling. I have my love for Rod Serling's work has no bounds, but there were some things he wasn't good at, and you can find him talking about. He talks about dialogue, and he said the problem with my writing is that all my characters sound like me. He's exactly right. He's not wrong about that. He's just so good at everything else.
Yeah.
Right? But
and self-aware enough to say that.
Yeah. Which means I think if he had lived longer, he died when he was 50. I think if he had lived longer, it might have been something he...
Isn't it crazy what he pulled off by 50?
It's amazing what he did, yeah. Yeah. Wow. I told you about his tape recorder situation.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. He
so cool.
Would have 3 stories going or 4 stories going at a time, according to my friend Stuart, who knew him. Yeah, so
special talent.
Yeah. So, but yeah, he did a lot. So, but in fact, knowing that he did that and that was a limitation he had is one of the reasons I tried very hard to not have that limitation. Like, okay,
Yeah.
Billy Wilder he always wrote with a partner because he was afraid that his English wasn't good enough because it was a second language. His English was perfectly fine, but for a long time I didn't, because of dyslexia, I wouldn't write by myself.
Yeah.
And then it's like, you know what? I'm going to write by myself. Like, I don't want to let this thing beat me, so I'm going to go ahead and write by myself.
Man.
But the thing that Rod Serling... Here's the thing. I always think, well, I'm luckier than Rod Serling because I had Rod Serling to study and he didn't. Right?
Yeah, that's
he was
a cool way of thinking about it.
Busy doing it.
Yeah.
Right? And so I could look and I could go, well, I could do that. I can stand on those shoulders, right?
Yeah.
And maybe I can see further. Maybe I can do something he couldn't do because he was busy being brilliant in all these other ways.
Yeah.
Right? And I can learn from that, and then maybe I can move the ball a little bit.
Yeah.
But
that's an interesting way of looking at it. That these heroes didn't have themselves to learn from. Like,
yeah.
We have gold all over the place.
Yeah.
We can watch movies on our phones at any place. Like, it's like the amount of stuff we have access to is amazing. I like those 3 points, though, that you mentioned a little while ago when you said tricks or whatever. You're like, well, age, education, where they're from. Mm-hmm. All those things should be considered. And it's like all those kind of answering those specific questions might help make sure that there are differences. Right?
Yeah.
Because the funny thing is, in real life, like, if you actually just listen to the people you're sitting around at the restaurant with, they're all every human being is unique. Right? It doesn't make sense to try to ignore that.
Right. Somebody who's into sports, it's going to use more sports metaphors than somebody who's not.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Even if sports never show up in the story you're writing.
Yep. Oh, what do they love? What do they hate?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. Characters.
Yeah. So I don't know if we answered her question or not.
Yeah, I think so.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so.
I hope we
did.
And
I think it was a really good question, and it's a really tricky one because it's so specific to the particular story you're writing. But just those really high level things, like who. Well, number one, you need to know who your character is, and that should be figure out your armature, figure out the character you need, and then who do they need to be surrounded by?
Yeah.
Right. And then looking at all these things, age and all this kind of stuff. But I would say the bigger thing that at least stood out to me that you mentioned is like, and how do you tell the truth with this? Mm-hmm. And how do you build in enough contrast so you can see, right? Going back to Frasier and Marty or Cheers or all these other great, things. And then just really simple stuff like also age, education, place they're from. But that big one you were just talking about where you didn't say that it wasn't just the part that you said that you can't make a liar out of them, but you don't judge your characters.
Right.
It sounds like a big one to take away from this too.
Sure. Yeah. Before we go, I was just thinking about contrast, and I was thinking about Jaws. Mm-hmm. Right. Because you have Chief Brody, who's afraid of the water and doesn't want anything to do with sharks, and who's he's surrounded by.
Yeah. Who
are the two guys he's surrounded by? Mm-hmm. Right. And those guys have their own contrast.
Yeah.
Right.
And different histories with water.
Right.
Themselves.
Different histories with waters and a different contrast, different attitudes.
Yeah.
Right. But both are like, oh, yeah, sharks. Quint has a, Ahab thing where he wants to
Yep.
kill the white whale, essentially.
Yeah.
And the other guy is just very interested in sharks. But those guys are not. They don't have the same fear.
Yeah.
As Brody. So it's knowing who he has to be surrounded by, because that contrast. He's afraid, and so he looks more afraid next to two guys who are not afraid.
Right. And then you also have age, education, place that they're from. That's what you mentioned.
Yeah.
Like, because it's funny, you could, both those two characters, right? You can answer all those questions.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
You know.
And Brody too, right? He's from New York, right?
Yep.
Yeah. He's not from this island. He's from New York.
Yep.
He's a New York cop. Yeah.
Yeah, that I mean, that movie, you know, it's like, it's just too much. There's so much stuff in there.
Yeah.
One of these days we should do a screening in a city or something where we can actually like watch a movie and then break it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, that would be cool.
I think it would be cool.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Brian.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to You Are A Storyteller. If you have any questions, or if there's a storytelling topic you'd like us to cover, leave a comment below or email us at hello@beliefagency.com.